Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Bird, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here at Historic St. Mary City. I want to welcome you here tonight for the first of our fall lecture series. Before we begin, I'm going to ask that everyone silence their phones. And as we're doing that, I'm going to point out our emergency exits. The first exit will be here at the front of the stage. There is an emergency exit directly behind you. Restrooms are through the double doors in the exhibit hall and directly downstairs. Now I would like to introduce our Maryland Heritage Scholar, Dr. Henry Miller.
Thank you, Donna. And thank all of you for being here tonight. About 4 or 5 years ago, I had a meeting with a gentleman who's in the audience tonight. His name is Eugene Roberts. Gene, would you stand, please? And Gene is the governor of the Society of the Ark and the Dove. And Gene came up with an idea that maybe the society would like to do something that would assist scholarship on the 17th century. So we came up with a partnership between the Society of the Ark and Dove and Historic St. Mary City that we call the Ark and Dove Scholarship. And this would have a graduate student who would come in, they would receive a stipend, they would get office space, they would get access to all of our cool collections, and be able to do their dissertation research here. That project has started 3 years ago, and we have an Ark and Dove scholar right now who's doing research at the lab. But the second scholar is the individual that is going to be speaking to us tonight about her exciting discoveries. But I would like to have the chief archaeologist and director of research come and introduce this special Ark and Dove scholar to you. So Travis Parno, would you please come over?
Good evening, folks. I'd echo Henry's thanks for being here tonight. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce both a friend and a colleague here, Dr. Laura Masur, but I want to tell you a little bit about her background, kind of set the stage for her talk tonight. Dr. Laura Masur is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Catholic University. Dr. Masur earned her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and History from the College of William and Mary in 2010. She remained in Williamsburg to earn her Master of Arts in Anthropology from William and Mary in 2013. Dr. Masur's master's thesis, titled Virginia Indians, NAGPRA, and Cultural Affiliation, Revisiting Identities and Boundaries in the Chesapeake, was awarded the William and Mary Graduate Studies Advisory Board's Distinguished Master's Thesis Award in the Social Sciences. From there, Dr. Masur moved north to Boston University, where she studied under Dr. Mary Beaudry, an advisor who I can tell you from personal experience is as exacting as she is brilliant. In the fall of 2018, Dr. Masur spent time at Historic St. Mary City after being named the 2018 Ark and Dove Scholar in Residence in HSMC's Department of Research and Collections. We enjoyed having her in the department, where we could learn as much from her as she hopefully did from us. Dr. Masur went on to become Dr. Masur in 2019 after authoring and successfully defending her doctoral thesis titled Priestly Plantations, an Archaeology of Capitalism and Community in British North America. Today, Dr. Masur's research is focused on the archaeology of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania from 1600 to the present. Her current project, Priestly Plantations, an Archaeology of Jesuit Missions in British North America, explores the complex material world of Jesuit priests, who acted as both slave-owning planters and missionaries in the colonial and modern Middle Atlantic. The project synthesizes archaeological collections from southern Maryland and central Pennsylvania, integrated with historical and archival evidence of agriculture and labor management to show connections between plantations and Catholic communities. Tonight, Dr. Masur will be sharing her work with us in a lecture titled Why Maryland? A Curious Tale of Jesuit Priests and an Unlikely Mission. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Masur.
I guess I have to move this down now. Maybe I should wear my heels today. So thank you so much. Henry
Henry and Travis for that very warm introduction. I'm so excited to be here. I was here for 2 months last fall, and St. Mary's City was such a welcoming environment to be in. I am a Virginian by birth, but now I feel like Maryland, and especially Southern Maryland and St. Mary's, can be my new adopted home. I always feel like I'm coming home when I come down here now. Especially staying in Mary Bohannon's house, it made it very home-like. You know, have a place to stay with a local. So tonight I'll be speaking in particular about Jesuit priests. Many of you are probably familiar if you're from this area originally, because the Jesuits had a presence in Southern Maryland from the beginnings of the colony that really continues to today. And so I want to begin by reflecting a little bit on the Jesuits and especially their motivations. These are missionaries who were in missions across the world. They are renowned scholars. They taught at universities in Europe. They founded missions in Japan and China. And so, to me, when I think about a place like Maryland, it's a place that feels like home. And this is a place that seems a little unusual to imagine as, the place of an exotic mission. Some of the letters that Jesuit priests are writing when they're thinking about coming to the Maryland mission. So these letters are written in 1640. They're written by specific Jesuit priests. So Father John Cooper, he's reflecting on his education in particular. And he's saying, I'm not particularly well educated, so send me to Maryland. I can minister to the barbarians. And by this, he's particularly referring to native people. Barbarian is a term that's used in this period to refer to people who are not Christian, who are not European. They are people who are others. And so he's saying, send me to the barbarians. I can educate them. I don't need to be, a university professor to be able to convert them to Catholicism. Father Christopher Morris has a slightly different motivation. He wants to come to Maryland for similar reasons, but he also is motivated by this idea of martyrdom. And you see a lot of references to the desire for martyrdom among Jesuit priests in the post-Reformation period. There's this sense of wanting to die for something that's meaningful. If you think about life expectancy and death, in this period of time, you could go anytime. This is not the world of modern medicine. And so there's this desire to die in a way that's meaningful. Martyrs are very common in missions because of the challenges of intercultural communications and different cultural traditions. And he's also talking about, the barbarians. He wants to go convert the barbarians. So he says, I almost called them barbarians, so there's this hesitancy because he wants to think of these native people that we know as Piscataways, Anacostans, native people of Maryland. He wants them to become what he calls members of Christ's mystical body. He wants them to become like us, right? And there's motivations. There's also an acknowledgement that Maryland as a mission is not just about converting native people. Father Francis Parker refers to his hesitancy. He wants to come to Maryland, but he says, I don't have a lot of experience dealing with heretics. By heretics here, he's referring to Protestants. Protestants that would be encountered frequently in England, as they would be in Maryland. He said, I'm not quite sure how to deal with the heretics, so maybe I'm not the best choice for coming to this mission. So if you look at these, there are some themes that run through these letters. Honesty and humility and zeal for this concept of mission that they sought to undertake. And they wanted to be made useful. And so we're going to focus on these two themes, this desire to convert native people, and also this sometimes eager, sometimes ambiguous feeling about dealing with heretics, dealing with Protestants as a method of conversion. So before I move on, I want to reflect a little bit on the Jesuits as an order of Roman Catholic priests. They're founded in the 16th century by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And this is in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, and they make specific vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, as do many members of Roman Catholic religious orders. But they also make a very special vow of mission. And this is important because it follows them around wherever they go. They're always trying to convert everyone that they interact with. They're always trying to bring them, as Father Christopher Morris says, into this, into Christ's mystical body. So the Jesuits have these spiritual expectations for what Maryland will, what coming to Maryland will be like. But they also have some expectations for how to fund their mission. They think about, these are reflections that are from a Jesuit archive about what they expected to find in the agricultural environment of Maryland. They thought there would be these wonderful grain yields. It'll be just like the fruits that we'll get will be just like Italy. There'll be figs and apples and oranges and olives. And you know as well as I do that these are some misplaced expectations about what you're going to get out of the soil in Maryland. But these are writings that are used in advertising in manuscripts sent in pamphlets around to try and get colonists to come to Maryland. You know, they're hoping to find gold. They see native people wearing ornaments of what they think is gold, which is likely copper, based on what we know of native ornamentation during this period. And so the Jesuits are invited by Cecil Calvert to come to Maryland, and they're invited specifically with this caveat that they would, quote, cause all acts of the Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as may be. Now, if you reflect on the Jesuits' vow of mission, that they're going to go out and they're going to try and convert everyone, there's a conflict here. I don't think Calvert did his homework in thinking about who he's recruiting to come and be basically the priests to come along and minister to Maryland's colonists. And so it rapidly becomes clear that they have no intention of operating quietly. And so the first 100 years of Maryland's history is filled with disputes among Jesuits, between Jesuits and the proprietary government, between them and the later royal government, powerful elites. And so, but with few exceptions, they're the only Roman Catholic priests in the colonies, in the British colonies in North America. And this is probably one of the factors that keeps them in Maryland. They say, if we leave, who will be here? What will happen to Catholics here? What will happen to the state of their souls? And so histories of Jesuits tend to focus on this aspect, their role in the birth of American Catholicism and America's fight for religious freedom. And in particular, the pivotal role of ex-Jesuits, the order is suppressed in 1773, so Jesuits become ex-Jesuits, and they're not Jesuits again until the restoration of the order in the early 19th century. But the role of ex-Jesuits in the fledgling of American Catholic Church. And this is seen as a story of successes. Because we like to think about our history that way, as a story of success rather than a story of failure. But in reality, this history is filled with some small successes, but also a lot of large setbacks. The Jesuits, when they arrive in Maryland, are not initially given permission by Calvert to live among native people. Eventually, several years into the mission, Father Andrew White succeeds in establishing missions among native people and converting Kittamucland, the Piscataway Kayak, so the paramount leader of the Piscataways. And this is a huge success. If you can convert a leader, then you can convert his people. And the Jesuits make alliances with the Patuxent. They're given a plantation called Mattaponi, so this is at the current location of Pax River. This is a plantation that it supports through agriculture, the financial needs of the mission. But conversions are not always as successful as the Jesuits might like them to be. In one story, they, let's see, so it's pretty fun. In one iteration of the story, They distribute what they call Ave Maria beads, so rosary beads, to a man who's requested them. But instead of using them for prayer, he grinds them up and he puts them in his tobacco pipe and he smokes them. And this is the ultimate desecration of a holy object, of something that's supposed to be used reverently and in prayer. And so the Jesuits are very careful to note, this is in an annual letter that's sent to Rome, that the guy gets bitten by a huge fish and he gets a festering wound and dies from it. So this is what happens when you grind up your rosary beads. So as I mentioned, they are able to acquire land from Mattaponi, donated by the King of the Tuxans around 1637. And this land is farmed by indentured servants and tenant farmers. And then the Jesuits go on to purchase another property, the plantation of St. Inigo's, which is where Webster Field is today. And so they are able to cultivate tobacco, support their mission through these properties. But then Lord Baltimore thinks about this a little bit, and he said, wait, the Jesuits are going and they're getting land from Native Americans. This is terrible. They're circumventing all of my rights. I want to make sure that nobody gets the wrong idea. And so he takes Mattaponi away. This is another one of these setbacks that the Jesuits are encountering. But the biggest setback they encounter is with Engle's Rebellion, starting in 1644. And this rebellion really devastates the Jesuits. All 5 Jesuit missionaries in Maryland at this point are captured. 2 are sent to England for trial, and then 3 others seemingly disappear. And based on what we know from one particular account, they were probably sent to Virginia. Now, Virginia at this point is anything that's not Maryland, right? And so the account suggests that they're sent among probably unfriendly Native people, and this is probably how they meet their deaths. But this is the first in many references to more ambiguous relationships with Native people that don't necessarily follow this prescribed expectation for what we think missions are. Okay, Jesuits go and they live in a village, they establish a mission. If any of you have seen the movie The Mission, you have this picture of what a mission looks like. You build a church in a Native village, and there's a particular set of expectations we have for what that looks like and the effect that that has on Native people. And this is not how things go. What happens after Engle's Rebellion? The Jesuit houses are plundered. At least 2 very richly furnished houses with diamonds and ruby-studded objects, which are probably sacramental vessels used for the Eucharist, are stolen. A house was burned. Their house at St. Inigo's is captured by rebels, and their indentured servants run away. So basically, their mission is completely devastated. Here's a quick look at their land holdings before Engle's Rebellion. You get a sense for the land in green is the land that they own. St. Inigo's Manor continues farther south. But they're significant landowners, they're significant elites, and this is probably why they're really an object of the rebels' ire during this point in history. Now I want to pause here because the Maryland mission, many histories of the Maryland mission as an Indian mission stop at this point, right after Engle's Rebellion. Jim Axtell, who's a historian of Native Americans in particular, says the Maryland mission was essentially a failure compared to better-known missions, long-standing missions like those in New France. And he says that this relates to the lack of personnel, so it's much more difficult to recruit missionaries and send them over from a Protestant country like England to a Protestant colony than it is from, for example, France. And then also it has to do with resources. They don't have the kind of money. Their mission isn't supported by the crown the way that a French or a Spanish or a Portuguese mission might be. And other historians have reflected on how the Piscataways are making a choice to align with the Jesuits as a political alliance against their enemies, the Susquehannocks. The commonality among these historical studies is that they stop. right around the 1640s. The Jesuit mission is seen to be over as an Indian mission by about 1645 or 1648. And this history of the Jesuits' Indian mission is iconic. So what you see here in this painting of the settlement of Maryland is incredibly important and really iconic in the popular imagination of Maryland. Because you need Indians for a mission. You can't have a mission without them, from this popular imagination about what a mission is. In reality, the concept of a mission is much more complicated than this. As you saw with the application letters that we just looked at, these Jesuits are preparing not only for missions in Maryland, but missions in other countries, but also within England itself. The Jesuits had an active presence in England as a mission, as in many other European countries, with the idea that we need to convert everyone back to Catholicism who has converted as a result of political schism and religious schism from the Catholic Church. And many of these Jesuits in England were caught and martyred in very gruesome and public ceremonies. And this is something that would be in the popular imagination of the Jesuits at this time, and it's something that's important for us to keep in mind when we're defining what a mission is. So the Jesuits returned to Maryland in 1648. They reestablished their plantation at St. Inigoes. They try and regain their property with moderate success and the intervention of lawyers, always. And they secure title to a second property at Port Tobacco, also known as St. Thomas. But then the Battle of Providence happens. The Puritans come to St. Inigoes again in 1655, and the Jesuits just escape. They just escape unnoticed by boat. Really, they say, under the nose of the Puritan rebels who are trying to capture them, trying to repeat these actions, send them to go on trial, again in England for their actions. So I want to focus on what happens after the Jesuits escape from southern Maryland. Again, they go to living in Virginia. This is a really ambiguous term. We don't know exactly where they go. It could be contemporary Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware. We're not entirely sure. And they write that they're living in huts. They send a letter back to England and then on to Rome. So they're living in huts. We don't have wine. We can't make the Eucharistic sacrifice. This is really tough for them. But what they don't say, oh, we should abandon Maryland. They said, send someone young. Send someone who's young and who can learn a native language. And this is something that's very curious if we think about the fact that this mission is supposed to be over. They're supposed to not be interacting with native people, but based on this account, they clearly are. This is the only historical reference we have to the fact that this is happening in this particular historical moment in around 1655 and 1656. So, again, the Jesuits who are sent to Virginia, at least one of them ends up passing away. We don't have a lot of details on this. But a couple years later, Father Fitzherbert gets back to Maryland, regains control of the plantations again, and establishes another plantation at Newtown about 10 years later. Now, this history of the Jesuits, as it continues going on, it's full of conflict. In an annual letter sent in 1681, apparently enemies had spread the rumor that the Jesuits owned enough land to support an army. And this is a real fear. Everyone always fears the Jesuits because they have so much political power in Europe. There's a fear that they're going to gain this amount of political power in the colonies as well. And so at this time they own about 8,000 acres. So what you can see here are the lands that they own. Their 3 plantations. In addition, they own land, continue to own land, about 400 acres in St. Mary's City. But the author's letter also talks about their struggles to keep land, the trouble collecting rents for tenants. And these struggles continue. So by 1710, the plantations produced, quote, little more than to keep our own. So they go from having a lot of land, they have successful plantations, and this probably relates to dips in the tobacco economy. It's much harder to make money at this point. And they're reflecting on, The procurators, the people who are managing this land, they're ignorant. The rustics, because they're tenant farmers, aren't paying their rents. We have to spend money on lawyers to protect our land. They must have had some very great connections with lawyers. And this is one of the most important ways that they protected their property. But by the early 18th century, they don't have enough money. They're not making enough money off their plantations to send over new missionaries. These troubles really compound as time goes on. And they start accruing debt. In 1717, Charles Carroll of Annapolis states that income from the plantations, quote, is so inconsiderable as hardly to afford a bare subsistence for those who are possessed of them. Now, this could be politically motivated. You say, oh, they don't make any money, they're fine. But this is probably, there are so many documents that talk about the Jesuits' financial struggles during the early 18th century that there's probably a lot of truth to them. And along with these financial setbacks, they're trying unsuccessfully to maintain Catholic schools, whether at St. Mary's City or at Newtown, and then eventually at a plantation on the eastern shore called Bohemia. And so it's probably not a significant exaggeration, all of these struggles they're going through, all of these problems. And if they're reflecting on their struggles to establish native missions, they're having trouble, maintaining their own property, let alone securing conversions. And so in 1727, the English Jesuits considered leaving Maryland in favor of going perhaps to French Louisiana or the Spanish West Indies. Because they don't have any means to improve their lands, to make this a more financially successful mission so that they can get the warm bodies over to go convert more people. And so what the Jesuits are doing in these early decades of the 18th century is really important. So I want to reflect on three big changes and what's happening on and off their plantations. Because what's happening on the plantations and off the plantations are really intimately connected. So they acquire numerous plantations during this period. So you go from having these 3 plantations down here in southern Maryland to expanding throughout Maryland and into Pennsylvania and Delaware, to the point that in 1772, they have 11 different plantations. There's another one I haven't been able to pin down. It's somewhere in here, but they sold it off before the Jesuits came through and did a lot of documentation later in the 19th and 20th century. So I'm still working on figuring out where exactly that one was located. And so these are compounded by struggles that the English Jesuits have with finances. They're having trouble, paying for the Maryland mission because the Maryland mission constantly loses the money. There's a lot of religious tumult in England. And so the Jesuit brothers who had come along with the priests, they serve in temporal roles there, managing plantations, managing things that are not strictly religious as a means of financial support for these missions. And the number of these Jesuit brothers declines from 4 in 1723, and this is pretty common throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, down to 1 in 1746 and none in 1754. And it really isn't common for the Jesuits to get lay brothers to manage these affairs on their plantations until after the order is restored in the early 19th century. And so the growth of the plantation, the decline of Jesuit brothers really changes the relationship these Jesuits have with what they're doing, what their everyday life is. They're not just working as missionaries, they're also planters, and everything that comes along with being a planter on a plantation. And so what goes along with this is their expanding reliance on enslaved African labor. While the plantations were farmed early by indentured servants, by 1717 there's a sizable labor force at Newtown Plantation that's enslaved. And by 1765, the Jesuits collectively own 192 souls. They are one of the largest slave owners in Maryland. And this, along with other factors, are really important for what they choose as priorities in their mission. The third topic I want to highlight is that The Jesuits are not writing about Native Americans, but they're also not writing clearly about their missions at all. When they write in code. So they write about factories. Factories is a code word for churches. They write about customers. These are their congregants, parishioners coming to their churches. Because the principle is, if their letters are intercepted, they would be punished. And this is the result of the Act to Prevent the Growth of Popery, which was passed in 1704, which really intrinsically changes the role of the Catholic Church in Maryland. And Maryland goes from being a place where the public practice of a variety of religions is permitted to you can only do that on private land. And so this feeds into why the Jesuits are expanding their plantations. Their expansion to Bohemia Plantation, which is right here, in this very remote corner of the eastern shore, happens right around the same time this act is passed. They're saying, well, maybe if we go far away, they won't bother us. Maybe we can start a school here. And so this really changes the way that not only their, what's happening, how their mission is operating, but also how they're talking about it. And so any references to Native Americans are almost entirely absent from the historical record, particularly from Jesuit records. In one exchange of letters, a priest named Joseph Mosley, who is working on the eastern shore, he manages a plantation here called St. Joseph or Tuckahoe, and he writes these regular letters back to his sister, Mrs. Dunn in England. And Mrs. Dunn, he at one point makes a romantic comment about, and the Indians, and she writes back curiously, asking about Indians, and he says what I read as this sort of, I'm going to cover my butt, like, I have nothing to do with the Indians. We're not allowed to deal with them. We're not allowed to do anything. The law forbids it. We're not allowed to interact with them at all. But his earlier letter seems to imply he did have interactions with them because they had opinions about the ways that European colonists were managing land and interacting with natural resources. So this is one of those hints. And I want to reflect on this as well as these other points, specifically about the expansion of this plantation or mission system, the continuation of American Indian missions, and then the reflection on slavery as not only a financial endeavor, but also as a missionary endeavor. The Jesuits don't really make an effort to separate these two. So I'm going to be spending the rest of my time reflecting on these three themes. The changing role of plantations, American Indian missions, and then interest converting enslaved Africans. And so when we look at the plantations, thinking about this first point, initially the plantations are managed by Jesuit brothers. They entrust the plantations to Catholic overseers. So in one story from 1638, the plantation at St. Inigo is managed by overseer William Lewis. And Lewis forbids Protestant indentured servants from reading aloud from their apparently incendiary text. You can imagine these individuals are really, they're trying to get this guy's goat. They know how he's going to react. So they read their text aloud just to make him angry. And so when this ends up, he makes some remarks back to him, and this ends up going to the court. And so these indentured servants complained, William Lewis of St. Inigo's, who saith that our ministers are ministers of the devil, and that our books are made by instruments of the devil, end up getting Lewis fined. And so it's little surprise that a few years later, when Engel's rebellion happens, that these indentured servants run away. So reflecting on this, if we skip forward about 100 years, and I'm doing this because this is when the historical record actually picks up, and I have the available documents to talk about what's going on in the plantations, the relationship between economics and religion. There are a few trends that emerge. One is that agricultural laborers are all enslaved by 1743 to 1744, when there's documentation. And there's also this conscious effort to convert not only African Americans on their plantation at St. Inigo's, but also to either recruit Catholic tenants or to convert the tenants who are renting their tenant farms. So between 1738 and 1754, individuals from about 8 tenant families, so these are the families that are listed here on the left. You probably recognize a lot of these names.
Yeah.
I feel like I met so many people with these names, and I'm like, yep, someone you're related to far back was, rented from the Jesuits. So in some, about 80% of tenant families had at least one practicing Catholic, whether it's someone directly connected, showing up in the sacramental records and in the rental records. And then some others, it's a family name that's connected somehow. So for example, leaseholders James, Elizabeth, and Richard Thompson are all mentioned in church and sacramental records from the 1760s, and they hold a lease on one of the tenant farms at St. Inigo's for a long period of time. So by 1767 to 1779, so these are the names that are listed on the right here, individuals from nearly every tenant family, 11 of 13 tenant families, have a sacramental connection to St. Inigo's. These tenant farmers are being instructed in things like the spiritual exercises. This is from, a scattered book of accounts. It says one exercise to Thomas Drury, one of the same to William Spalding. These are individuals who are documented as tenants to the Jesuits at this time. And this is still happening by the 20th century. This photo from 1630 or 1930s, here's the interior of that church at St. Inigo's. And if you blow it up and look at the label here, you can see the name of Dominic Rayleigh, who is the tenant farmer for well over 50 years, and then he retires and becomes a caretaker of the property. He's a member of this church. He continues going to the church when the majority of people belonging to this parish start going to another church that's farther inland. He remains connected to it. We also know that this is happening because in a 1788 pamphlet, a reverend, non-Jesuit reverend named Patrick Smith criticizes the then ex-Jesuits for inviting Catholics to, quote, walk around the skirts of the overgrown plantations of the clergy. He does not have very positive feelings about the Jesuits. And he says their only goal is to increase the values of their land, rather than fulfilling the spiritual needs of people, thinking about their economic needs. It would be much better for them economically if they moved west and were able to acquire their own land. And so the Jesuits are cultivating quite literally religious symbolism on their plantations. By the time better documentation picks up in the 19th century, Joseph Moberly, who's a Jesuit brother who manages St. Inigo's, says he's raising sheep not just because they're important economically, because they are associated with moral virtue and Christ's sacrifice. They're an important symbol to show to the people who are living on the plantation. Some of the plantations farther north are used for cultivating grapes and making wine, for sacramental wine. And at St. Inigo's and some other plantations, laborers are called to prayer multiple times a day with bells, tolling for Angelus prayer. So this is a type of prayer that's done morning, noon, and night. People paid pew rent, and they paid pew rent in any way they could, frequently through animals or meat. I come across references in the archives to, pew rent paid in veal. That sounds like great pew rent to me. And when you look at the artifact record as well, you have medals like this. These come from St. Inigo's plantations on the area known as Old Chapel Field. This is on Webster Field. And they come from this area right here. These two medals and then a reliquary cross come out of the ground. And the reliquary cross, I couldn't believe for a site that's associated with Jesuits. It would have held a holy relic of a saint. potentially, and that makes sense. But these types of medals are much more common at sites associated with missions, like native missions, and the distribution of artifacts like this is well documented as missionary outreach. And so showing up on plantations, like St. Inigo's, tells me that there's something going on here that's not just the Jesuits practicing their own religion. The plantation itself is functioning as a mission to indentured servants, to African Americans, to anyone who comes to the plantation. One thing that I find really interesting about this medal here, this is a medal of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and it looks like someone, held it a lot and they rubbed it, because the surface of the medal is really rubbed smooth. I found a very similar medal to this at a site in Pennsylvania, which I'll be getting to shortly. And it's very similar, but you can see the details on St. Ignatius's garb in that one. They've been, all but rubbed away on this version of the medal. So, as I mentioned before, established histories say, the Jesuit mission was a failure. The mission ended in the 1640s. But what if I told you that the historians miss some key, albeit vague, historical sources? And these are sources that I found in some really obscure publications from the 1950s, published in the Woodstock Letters, which is the Jesuits' journal. And they seem to have been sitting there, just waiting for me to come find them, for 70 years. There are references in the Jesuit relations. So these are the French Jesuits' reports on what they're experiencing in French missions. And occasionally they mention that Susquehannocks show up to the French Jesuit missions, and they're already baptized, and they're instructions, and they have knowledge of Catholic missions. They have knowledge of Catholic beliefs. This is happening in the 1630s to 1670s, and this tells me, maybe when they're taken over to Virginia in the 1640s or the 1650s, maybe they do interact with the Susquehannocks in a way that isn't just, they're dead, right? There's some kind of missionary activity happening here. Jesuits are invited by Thomas Dongan, the governor of New York, between 1683 to 1688, to establish a mission, because he's trying to counter the political influence of French Jesuits by bringing English Jesuits in. Yeah. You always want the Jesuits on your side. They're very effective. The Jesuits established missions in New York, in native villages, and these at least last into the early 18th century, because an Anglican minister writes a story about a Jesuit who's living in a native village. He doesn't even have a shirt. He's just living in a wigwam like a native person. And he petitions the governor of New York. This is when the governor is once again a Protestant and not a Catholic. And the governor says, not only will I not give you a shirt, you're gone, like leave New York, get away. And these events are not well documented, because the Jesuits don't want to write these kinds of things down, because they could get in a lot of political trouble if information like this falls into the wrong hands. But some of the more obvious references to missions like this come from Bishop Laval of Quebec, writing about an Indian mission in New Sweden. So this is the general vicinity of Delaware, near Maryland, which adjoins Virginia. It really could be anywhere, based on, this is someone who's writing from much farther north. And it's an old mission reestablished among great people, which uses the Algonquin tongue. Algonquin implying to us that this could be, people who are living along coastal Delaware, Maryland, and that general area. And he specifies that this is tended by English Jesuits. And some of the best, references here come from suspicious Protestants. They really don't like the Jesuits. They don't want them involved in their colonies. So Jasper Denkart says, there's not an Indian fort between Canada and Maryland, or there's not a Jesuit who teaches and advises the Indians. And I've reflected a lot about these references, because maybe this is just exaggeration. Perhaps there is some exaggeration in these accounts. I don't know if Jesuits were at every port between Canada and Maryland, but there probably were a few at these ports. So it's important to take these references with a grain of salt. But the strongest reference comes from the Jesuit catalogs himself. Father Thomas Digges is listed as living in Susquehannock in 1749, and then again in 1750 and 1752. And this tells me that, there's some sort of a mission. It's probably along the Susquehanna River, maybe among Susquehannocks. And so these references keep coming out of the woodwork. And for me as an archaeologist, I start thinking and I try and put two and two together. And one of the things that comes to mind are finds of Roman Catholic artifacts. So right here you can see with the farm symbol, you can see all the Jesuits' plantations located here. And then they have occasional sort of churches that are not associated with significant land holdings. So Philadelphia, Lancaster here. This is the church, two churches that are in Adams County, Pennsylvania. And there are a lot of native sites with Roman Catholic artifacts, really close to these. There are a bunch of sites along the Susquehanna River. There are sites that are along the Potomac, both in Maryland and in Virginia. And if any of you have heard from Dr. Julie King, she's been, her surveys have been instrumental in finding some of these artifacts. And I think she's a little suspicious of my theory that these are coming from English Jesuits. Because the prevailing theory is that all of these artifacts are just trickling down as trade items from New France, from Canada. Because the Jesuits are well established there, this is, a really, it's not a bad theory about where these artifacts are coming from. But I think the smoking gun for looking at this and trying to answer this question of do the Jesuits have Indian missions in the 18th century, if we look at a couple of these sites along the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, you get a clearer view of what's happening. So here is what appears to be a rosary, but the metal that's attached to it it's not a crucifix that would have ordinarily been put on a rosary. It's I think it's George II. It's a very curious combination. Clearly, this is not being used the way that the Jesuits intended. And other artifacts are showing up. There are many crucifixes, crosses, religious medals. And these are two specific sites. These come from two specific sites called Conestoga Town. This is occupied by the descendants of the Susquehannocks, called Conestogas at this point, and then Conoy Town, which is occupied by descendants of Piscataways, called Conoy at this point in history. And it's kind of a misnomer to call them a town because these are all native burials. The town itself, everything that was excavated in the 1960s and 1970s are native burials. And so when you look at these two artifacts from Conestoga Town, this is in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, what's curious is these come from burials that are not traditional native burials where someone is in a flex burial, so imagine this like being in the fetal position. They're extended burials. They're buried in a very European style. And so what we see here, there's still a lot of grave goods buried with people, which is a more native tradition. So you really see a merging of European traditions and native traditions in these burials. And something similar is going on at Conoy Town. Crucifixes, medals, and there are a lot of these. I went back to the State Museum in Harrisburg to try and look at these, and there are gobs of these beads. And one of the things I'm trying to find out is if these were shipped over from Europe as rosary beads, or if these were trade beads that were made into rosaries on site. So something like this, where you can see these very typical links between objects. You see this very typical style of the way that the way a rosary looks today. And then you look at things like this where you have these beads, you have a cross here. It's a curious way of manipulating material culture. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's going on at these sites. But the one thing I do think is happening is that the Jesuits are here. They're bringing these objects. These sites are occupied between about 1710 and maybe 1765. They sort of drop off because if any of you are familiar with Pennsylvania history, the Paxton Boys, so these are a group of Scots-Irish settlers. They really don't like Native people. They come in and they massacre Native people at Conestoga in 1763. And so we don't see much else going on in terms of interactions between Jesuits and Native people in Pennsylvania after this point. Most Native people end up migrating either into Pennsylvania or up into New York or farther west. But you do see records continuing interactions between Scataways in particular and Jesuits at their church at St. Ignatius Church, this is St. Thomas Plantation at Cote Tobacco in Charles County. And in the Jesuits' collections of letters, the Woodstock letters, they specifically refer to a group of people they call resorts. And this is a pejorative term today, but it's important that they're documenting this because this shows us that they acknowledge that these people are Native people, they are of Native descent, and they have this continued relationship with the parish. And this continues as time goes on, such that when they had the 375th anniversary Mass, you have contemporary Piscataways that are coming to this church. They're involved with, an anniversary Mass. And so this tells me that James Axtell was wrong. These missions not only continued, it wasn't just this 11-year period, they continued. And they were successful. I think it's a very successful mission if your goal is to come in and convert people and their descendants remain to continue to practice this faith several hundred years later. So I'm going to move on to my final point, which is about the role of the Jesuits, their interactions with slavery, with African Americans on their plantations. There are a lot of references in the Woodstock letters dating to the late 19th and early 20th century that are evidence that the Jesuits are really trying to reach out and evangelize African Americans. And this is the continuation of a tradition that starts on plantations. One priest named Father Fidel de Bouvel, talking about St. Thomas Manor, in 1831 notes that he, quote, confessed 40 Negroes. They came from 2, 4, and 6 miles by foot while fasting despite the rain and snow. And what's notable is that these individuals are coming not just from the plantations owned by Catholic slave owners, they're coming from Protestant plantations as well. And this tells me that this is a free choice that African Americans are making. They want to come here, and they probably have varied motivations, and that's a subject for a whole other talk, why they're choosing to participate in Catholicism. And I want to be careful because, although the Jesuits are instructing African Americans, they're admitting them to a sense of, if not bodily equality, a sense of spiritual equality with basically Euro-American descendants. But we need to be careful and not say that slavery under the Jesuits was benign. But we do need to acknowledge that spirituality was involved, and it played an important component on this process. And this process continued after the Civil War. And this is particularly notable in sites in Prince George's County, which you can see pictured here. There are a lot of artifacts that have come out of these sites. These sites have been excavated primarily because of development. And so if you imagine, suburban expansion is the friend and foe of the archaeologist, because we get to see all the cool stuff, but then all the sites are destroyed and we can't really go back and investigate anymore. And these African American artifacts religious artifacts show up from African American sites. These are from Willow Grove Plantation, which is just a couple miles from the Jesuits' plantation at White Marsh. There's a Holy Family medal, a small statue of the Virgin Mary are coming out of either slave quarters or tenant farms on a plantation owned by Protestants. So this is showing us the same narrative that's happening in Charles County is probably happening in Prince George's County as well. There's this choice among African Americans to respond to Jesuit evangelization and to practice Catholicism, perhaps in a modified way, as a mixture with their own cultural traditions. And these artifacts are also showing up Northampton Quarter, which is another site in Prince George's County. Crosses, crucifixes, medals, including a medal that's a St. Ignatius medal that's actually written in Chinese. The inscription is in Chinese. Yeah, it's not the kind of sign you would expect to see, but it's coming out of the site probably intended for a Chinese mission, and then at some point, somehow it makes its way over and ends up in a slave quarter in Maryland. This is the kind of thing that's a very unexpected find. And probably a lot of these artifacts were held by families for a long period of time. An African-American woman named Elizabeth Hawkins lived at Northampton Quarter with her husband Robert in 1870. And her family lived there through the early 20th century. Their daughter, Lizzie and Robert's daughter, Rosa, was baptized Catholic, and the documentation is kept at Holy Family Catholic Church. And this was the Jesuits' mission to African-American tenant farmers. And so when you're looking at the historical records and the archaeological records together, it gives a clearer view of what this mission looks like. You know, the Jesuits were making accounts of distributing objects like medals and rosaries. And African Americans here in St. Mary's County are requesting on several occasions holy water, scapulars, and one object that's called dead little hearts, which I think may refer to either the Sacred Heart of Jesus or the Immaculate Heart of Mary. These are very popular devotions in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it may be related to a sodality that's out of St. Ignatius Church at St. Inigo's or St. Peter Claver Church. And it's important to note that although the Jesuits are reaching out to African Americans and giving them this opportunity for spiritual equality, their accounts are strongly racist. They have very paternalistic attitudes about the role of African Americans in society and their own paternal role in relation to them. And so it's hard to say if this is one of those situations where it's really hard to talk about people as good or evil. They're very complicated people. They support Black Catholic communities, but they also don't acknowledge them as truly equal. You also see evidence coming from St. Inigo's plantation. This house is associated, the one I mentioned, Dominic Rayleigh, this is the house that he would have lived in when he was caretaker. But before that, I'm pretty sure a woman named Louisa Mason lived here. She was enslaved by the Jesuits and remained living on the plantation after her emancipation. Archaeologists who weren't supposed to be digging a test unit dug a test unit in the 1990s. I'm frankly really glad they did it because I can very easily connect it with this building right here, which probably was built at some point in the early 19th century. And I think this is the part of the house that was connected with Louisa Mason. And in the backyard of the house, there's a tack from a crucifix. Maybe this was displayed in the garden. Maybe at some point it fell off a crucifix and was discarded. Maybe it was lost. But again, it's these connections between Louisa Mason, who is celebrated when she passes away in 1909. There's an obituary written for her, and they talk about her devotion and really her devotion to the Jesuits, and they offer a requiem mass for her because of this. And so, as we're reflecting on the legacy of the Jesuit mission, people of a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds are really important in the Jesuits' decision to stay in Maryland. Yes, it's the conversion of these heretics, these Protestant heretics, But it's also the draw of native barbarians, as they describe it. And then also, as time goes on and they're forced into, or they choose to enter into a system of African slavery, that also becomes commingled with the mission. And I'd argue that these groups of people like Frank Campbell, who was enslaved by the Jesuits at St. Inigo's. This is Frank Campbell here, sold to Louisiana in 1838. People like Kinnamaclin are as much a story of this, the story of religious freedom, the story of the Jesuits, as the Jesuits themselves, and as the people who are much better documented in most historical records. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
How do you explain Protestant manor owners and slave owners allowing their slaves to have Catholic items and even going to a Catholic mission?
It's a great question. It's something that I ask myself a lot. The few letters that I've seen reference the fact that they're just ambivalent. They just really don't care what enslaved Africans are doing with their time off, just so that they're not, engaging in any kind of rebellion. And there might be also, they may also share some of these sentiments that the Jesuits have, that instilling Christian values in enslaved people is a way of getting them to be more subservient laborers. So this might be something that Protestant landowners, Protestant enslavers are thinking about in addition to, the Jesuits themselves. It's a method, it can be an inadvertent method of control.
Why did they pick Maryland to start with? Did they have to try to go to Jamestown or Charleston or any of the other English settlements?
It's a great question. So, did the Jesuits go to Newfoundland at all? No.
No, they didn't. It was a diocesan priest. As a result of that experience, the Calvinists sought out the Jesuits and what?
Okay.
The reason is really the Calvinists.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's they're invited to come. They're invited to come, and that's why they come. They see it as an opportunity because they're having this kind of support. There are a lot of Roman Catholic artifacts that come out of the ground at Jamestown, and there's not a great explanation for why this is happening. I don't think there's necessarily secret Jesuits at Jamestown. I'm a little surprised about that. And actually, Travis has looked at a lot of these artifacts and has written about them, published about them. And there's probably a lot of different ways that you can interpret what's happening there, whether people are secretly Catholic, or perhaps it's a holdover. They're not strictly speaking Catholic, but they maintain some of these material traditions that we associate today with Catholicism.
Did you find anything, new information on Father Andrew White, that most of us who were displaced into Maryland for years, probably the first Jesuit name that we hear when we come at the first Mass at St. Clement's Island. But he has extensive writings. Anything you can add about this education? They're really
I've read through the writings. And so I'm familiar with them. They're an important account because compared to Virginia, you don't have as many, essentially ethnographic accounts, like accounts of native traditions in Maryland as you do in Virginia. So in that sense, it's a very important account of native traditions, their political alliances, their cultural traditions in general. I haven't gone into them in great depth because my focus has been in later periods and looking specifically at the plantations.
Do you know how many Jesuits were sent to establish a mission, whether it was a lot or?
Initially, there are 2 Jesuit priests and then 1 Jesuit brother who come to Maryland. At any given point in the history, there may be between 3 and I think about 20 Jesuits, and there are more as time goes on, and there are more needs as they expand into Pennsylvania and Delaware.
Did you
come across a native of Marylanders who became Jesuits and would be part of your mission?
Yes, you might be able to speak to this better than I can.
Well, the Neos, all the Neo brothers, including the eventual Archbishop and so on, they were all sent off to Europe to study. That was the thing. They would start here with tutorials or at Bohemian Manor, and then they would go off to Europe to study. Eventually, at some of the St. Omer's, and a lot of them said, "I like this. You know, I like having good teachers and learning about my faith." And they end up being Jesuits and come back. So there's a surge in the latter half of the 1700s of returning Jesuits who had gone. Neil was gone for about 20 years, 25 years. You know, he left as an adolescent, came back as a priest, had been working for a couple of years.
And through the plantations, this is best documented in the 19th century, the Jesuits are establishing, you know, perhaps formal, perhaps informal networks for getting students that are like initial stage of training to get a sense if they would make good priests. So there are actually some apprenticeship records between, it might be one of the Neal, members of the Neal family, and then some, you know, boys where they're basically indentured, and the planter priest is supposed to teach them like the art and mystery of their trade. So it's this early, probably represents this early stage of education where they would get their classical, their introduction to classical languages, classical studies. So if the Jesuit deemed them, you know, fit to go on to seminary and to become a priest, they would have that background education. And you see this really across the plantations in the 19th century. Sometimes there are tenant farmers or laborers associated with the plantations where they want to become a priest. And this connection to the Jesuits, that's really through agriculture, is how they get their foot in the door. It's through this connection that they're able to go to the Jesuit novitiate and continue their studies.
Have you found any references to any other orders, Catholic orders that were extant in Maryland or as part of the Jesuit, in the same time period that the Jesuits were populating?
There is a Franciscan that comes, I think, in 1670, 1671. And that's the one reference that's well documented. Around the time of the American Revolution, you see an influx of more priests, especially when the Jesuits are suppressed by the Vatican, and you have the beginnings of the American Catholic Church, where you don't have to practice only on the plantations. You can have public churches again, and so you see an expansion. And this actually causes some trouble because you're getting priests who don't necessarily fit in. Like, what's motivating them to come to the colonies and leaving Europe? And there are some hints at like scandals that are happening of priests coming over and maybe not doing horrible things, but things where they're forced to go in retreats and reflect, and they're not necessarily lining up with the established hierarchy of priests.
Just wondering, you were talking about two populations of enslaved people and of the native people. Were there Catholic communities of settlers here that these priests were serving as well?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. There are communities that tend to be centered around the plantation. So there's communities that, like, where everyone comes to the plantation. The Jesuits are also basically riding circuit all around Maryland and Pennsylvania, and they're moving between plantation and farm and holding masses there. And this is sort of their MO. This is how their ministry continues. And this is really the history that's pretty well documented. If you read any kind of conventional history of the Maryland mission, of the Pennsylvania mission, this is the story that you hear. And so why I focused on these other communities is because their stories aren't heard, and their stories are important aspects in these histories. And what I'm trying to do is add use archaeology to balance out, what we don't know, and show a more holistic story of what's happening in Maryland.
Would it have been common
the tiny one, right? So slave ownership in Maryland is in the hundreds. In the French, Spanish, and Portuguese world, it's in the tens of thousands. Jesuits are one of the largest slave owners in the world. They have large systems of plantations throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and these are the plantations that are far more financially successful than Maryland because probably for a number of reasons, but one of them is just that the crops are more lucrative. They're growing, they have wine haciendas in Nazca in Peru. They have sugar plantations in the French Caribbean. So Maryland is this tiny area compared to this really expansive topic. And there are a lot of scholars, we're trying to get ourselves together and organize ourselves so we can really broach this topic and talk about slavery among the Jesuits, what's distinctive about it, how it might be different from slavery in general, so we can talk comparatively and really say something about this tradition.
Where are the missions located in Pennsylvania?
So there's two main missions that are established in the 1740s. One of them is in Berks County. It's known as Kutzenhofen. I'm sure I would go to the place and they would tell me a different pronunciation. And then another one is in Adams County. Originally it's York County, but the county lines are redivided, and that's called Conewago. So those are the two main ones. There's another called Paradise that is bequeathed to the Jesuits in the 1840s.
Well, thank you very much for tonight's lecture. Thank all of you for joining us tonight, and please drive home safely.